Okay, so we left off last time talking about the pelvis, and we're going to start off there as well. So just to remind you, the pelvis, there's three bones on each side of the pelvis. So there's an ilium, ischium, and pubis on the right side, and those three bones on the left. They fully fuse together, so when you hold an adult pelvis in your hand, it looks like one bone, but technically it's those three bones, and they fully fuse to right around when we're in our early 20s, actually. That's when they become fully fused. So just to remind you, I'm going to call up my first whiteboard, and I'm going to continue talking about the pelvis. That includes the ilium, ischium, and pubis. We have those three bones on the left, those same three bones on the right, mirror image of each other. They join, the pelvis joins anteriorly in the front at the pubic symphysis, the two rami of the pubic bones. And then posteriorly, the pelvis joins the two iliac bones, the two ilium bones, right and left. They join with the sacrum. So posteriorly, I'm just going to write post. Posteriorly, there is something called the SI joint that joins the pelvis together, and that stands for sacroiliac joint. And anteriorly, the pelvis joins at the pubic symphysis. So that's how it's constructed. We did highlight some of the markings. I want you to go over that before you take the quiz on Monday. The markings on each of those bones, meaning things like the iliac crest, the acetabulum, the greater sciatic notch. And then down in the ilium, there's the ischium. There's the ischial spine, the ischial tuberosity. In the pubic bones, the symphysis in front, the two rami that come to a point, and also that obturator or obturator foramen, that huge hole that's sort of between the pubic bones and the ischial bones. What I'd like to do now is remind you of the structure that we drew. If we have a bowl, an open bowl like this, and it sort of comes down, and there's an open bottomed bowl. This upper lip of the bowl is what we call the pelvic brim. And this would be the lowest lumbar vertebrae in the back. And the ilium, that big bone of the ilium, sort of comes up above that brim like this, down to the front. I'm going to highlight that brim in a different color in red. Everything above that pelvic brim we call the false pelvis. So all of the bony structure above it, right up here, is all included in what we call the false pelvis. Everything below it is called the true pelvis. So that would be bony material down here. So that opening defines the false pelvis from the true pelvis. Most of the bony structures are down here, the bone, the true pelvis. And so that superior inferior part is defined by that brim. So I'm going to just write pelvic brim. And the organs that are included in the false pelvis region are superior to obviously the organs in the true pelvis. So this would be things like within the false pelvis would be contained the lower intestines, the uterus in the female, also the top of the ovaries as well, and the very top of the urinary bladder in both male and female. So we find these organs, technically it's considered part of the abdomen. That's why it's called the false pelvis. I'm going to write urinary bladder. Then down lower in the true pelvis, we find organs like the large intestine, the very distal part of the large intestine, the rectum, the bulk of the urinary bladder, the female vagina and cervix, as well as in the male, the prostate gland. I'm just going to put a little male sign to remind you that's a male organ. There is a thing called pelvimetry, which is females, typically pregnant females, usually by their obstetrician, have measurements done of their pelvis to ensure that there's going to be a safe, somewhat uncomplicated labor and childbirth. The pelvimetry, that just word means the measurement of the pelvis. If there's constriction, if the birthing canal is too narrow, too small, then a cesarean section is warranted in those situations. Now I'm going to briefly just give you a short laundry list of the major differences between the male and female pelvis. So I'll call up a new whiteboard. I'm trying to the easiest way to do this is kind of a table format. So I'm just going to write male, female, pelvis. Let's do the female on this side and the male over here. And their comparisons. So we say things like the female pelvis is typically wider than the male pelvis, also a bit shallower. So I'm just going to write wider, shallower. So this would be a bit this is relative to each other. So the male pelvis tends to be narrow and a little bit longer, relatively speaking. The female pelvis tends to be lighter and thinner. That means the bone material. So this would obviously be a bit heavier. So I'm just going to write heavy. And the bones are typically a little bit thicker. The acetabulum in females, that's the socket of the hip joint where the head of the femur fits in. That's that crater, the socket of the ball and socket joint. Tends to be a little bit smaller in diameter than the male acetabulum. It also faces more anterior, more toward the front. So this one would be larger, and more lateral facing to the side. The obturator foramen, that big hole that we see down in the ischium pubic region, tends to be oval shaped in females. That big hole, obturator foramen, is oval shaped in females, and in males it tends to be more round shaped. If we were in real lab, we'd have an example. We'd be holding a male pelvis and a female pelvis, and it would be more obvious to see these differences with your own eyes. The iliac crest in females tends to be less curved. I'll try to draw a picture of what that means. And in the male, it's just more curved. Think of that pelvic brim and the iliac crest on top of it. In females, that bowl tends to be more like this, the iliac crest. In males, it tends to flare out a little bit more curved like this. The greater sciatic notch, that's that. If you look at the ilium from the side, it has this upside down V-shaped notch where the sciatic nerve runs. So the greater sciatic notch in the ilium in females tends to be a little bit wider. And in males, it's that V notch is narrower. That sciatic nerve runs through there. That's the longest nerve in the human body, by the way. The sacrum, the sacral bone or the sacrum tends to be wider and slightly shorter in females. So in males, obviously, it's more narrow in shape and a bit longer. The coccyx, the tailbone, tends to be more movable and slightly more curved in females. For birthing purposes, obviously. So movable and a little bit more curved. This tends to be more static or stable, less curved. And finally, the pubic arch, and I'll describe to you what that is. The pubic arch is wider in females. And in males, it tends to be a bit narrower. If you look at the pelvis from the front, the lower bone, so we have this brim, this upper brim of the iliac bones like this. And then the acetabulum, where the socket of the femur is, down here. Those ischial bones that hang down. And there's the obturator foramen or foramen. This is the pelvic arch right here, the angle between these two bones down here. It tends to be wider in females and narrower in males. The angle between these two bones right here, coming up to the pubic symphysis. All right, we are finished with the pelvis, and we're going to go to the lower limbs, the extremities of the lower limbs. And as we go down to the lower limbs to the feet, we'll be finished with this business. So this is worth noting. There are 30 bones in each. That means right and left lower limb. Notice that's the same as the upper limbs. The upper limbs had 30 bones each as well. But there's a little bit of a difference. I'm going to say this verbally right now, and I might write it down later when we get to the ankles. But in the upper limb, there's 30 bones total. Lower limb, 30 bones total. But the wrist bones, the carpals, there's 8 total. The tarsals, the ankle bones, there's only 7. And where that bone in the lower limbs is made up, that total 30 is made up, is because we have a kneecap called the patella. So that's where the difference is between the two. I'm just going to list them now in order. It goes femur. That's the large upper leg bone. I'll do the kneecap next. That's the patella. Tibia is the larger of the 2 lower leg bones. Fibula is the narrower, smaller of the 2 lower leg bones. Then we have tarsals. Those are the ankle bones. There's 7 of those. Remember, there's 8 carpals in the wrist. We make up for that by this bone right here with the 30 total. There's metatarsals. Just like metacarpals in the hand, there are metatarsals in the foot. There's 5 of those. Those are the first long bones in the front of the solid portion of the foot, the anterior part. And finally, phalanges, the toes. And there's 14 total in each foot, just like in the hand, the fingers of the hand. So let's talk about these in order. We'll first hit the femur. Let me turn something off here. The femur is the longest, strongest, heaviest bone in the human body. It's proximally, it has an articulation. That means closer to the midline of the body. Proximally, it articulates at what you and I call the hip joint, that ball and socket joint of the head of the femur with the acetabulum of the ilium. So that's its proximal articulation. Distally, the femur articulates with the tibia to form the knee joint. Okay, so there's two joints, a proximal end and a distal end. Some books say superior and inferior. I prefer proximal and distal. This term, angle of convergence, is given to the femur bones. I'm going to quick draw a hip bone here. There's the acetabulum. I'm just drawing a quick pelvis. Here would be the head of the femur, right and left. And then the femurs come down. This term, angle of convergence, refers to the angle that the femur bone comes inward this way as it comes to the knee. And it comes in toward medially, the angle medially like this. Here would be the tibia down in the lower leg. So here's the knee that I'm drawing the knee joint right now. This is the angle of convergence. Everybody has an angle of convergence. In females, it tends to be greater. So I'm just going to write this angle of convergence tends to be greater in females. The fovea capitis. This is a divot or a small pit in the head of the femur. So it's this pit. If you were to look at the head of the femur, it looks round like this. Right up here, there's a small pit. It's not a hole that goes all the way through the bone. It's more like a little crater. And it's a point of ligament attachment from the femoral head to the acetabulum. So there's ligaments that actually attach the femoral head to the acetabulum, the socket part of that joint. I'm just going to write for ligament attachment. The neck of the femur down here, that's the constricted portion under the head of the femur. The neck tends to break more often, more than the pelvic bones, actually. All right, now I'm going to hit a new whiteboard and just quickly draw a anterior and possibly a posterior, what the femur actually looks like. This is in your book, so I'm going to try to be quick. But we can label some of the pieces, some of the parts. So this is kind of an anterior front view, and the posterior view, if we flip this bone over, would look something like this. So this would be posterior or back view. First things to note on the back side, we already defined the head and the neck of the femur. There are two major processes that stick out, large bone processes. We call this the greater, because it's higher, the greater trochanter, and this the lesser trochanter. You can see them better from the back side. Those are points of attachment. They're huge processes that stick out from the bone. Basically, the greater and lesser trochanters attach thigh muscles and the gluteus maximus, the buttocks muscle. We can feel this greater, what sticks out, this greater trochanter on our hips. It's the most lateral point on your hip bone that you feel. So you're not actually feeling pelvis down there. You're feeling this, the side of this greater trochanter. We can't feel the lesser trochanter. It's buried deep in muscle. There's also something called the gluteal tuberosity. So most of the markings are on the posterior side. There's two ridges of bone that stick up that merge into one sharp ridge of bone. These would be the gluteal tuberosity. Tuberosity also means a piece of bone that sticks up or outward from the main bone. That's obviously for gluteal muscle attachment. And then this narrow crest of bone is called the linea aspera. And that's like a narrow ridge of bone that attaches muscles as well. So both of them are for muscle attachment. This one's more for hamstring and thigh muscle attachments. This one's for the gluteus maximus muscle attachment. At the distal end, that's down here at the knee end. So this is proximal, this is distal. Some books, like I said, call this a superior. You can't see what I'm writing, really? You can't see my whiteboard at all?
No, we can't see it.
That's weird. Could you see it earlier?
Yeah, I could see it earlier, but you started talking maybe like a minute or two ago and it disappeared.
The whiteboard disappeared? Okay, let me try something. So, can you see this picture?
No.
Can anybody see this picture?
I can.
You can?
I can see it as well.
Okay, it must be your computer then. I don't know what happened because all the other students can see these diagrams.
Okay, I can see it now. There was a button I had to press.
Okay, cool. So back to the femur. This is the posterior backside. This is the anterior front side. We were just labeling this is superior, inferior. I like to use the terms proximal and distal. Depends on what book you read. All right, getting down to, so we talked about this upper portion, getting down to the distal portion at the knee. Some bone markings that are worth noting that I'll expect you to know. These two big knobs down here are called condyles. So these are the femoral condyles. A condyle is a smooth projection that articulates with another bone. And the reason we call these condyles is because right here, the condyles are going to articulate with the lower leg bone, the tibia. The term epicondyle refers to this small bump on the lateral side of the condyle. So there's an epicondyle on the lateral side, which I've marked, as well as the medial side also has an epicondyle. So this is considered a condyle. This is a condyle. Here would be, in red, would be the epicondyles. And then there's another prominent little bump on the medial side. I think your book highlights it. Yeah, it's called the adductor tubercle. Sorry, I spelled that incorrectly. Tubercle. All of these So the condyles are for articulation, creating a joint with the lower leg bone. But the epicondyles and this tubercle, adductor tubercle, are really to help create the knee joint, ligaments that would run, connections for ligaments that would run on the lateral side of the knee to sort of encapsulate that joint. Just checking my notes to make sure that I mentioned everything. The tuberosities, linea aspera, yep. The medial lateral condyles, epicondyles, good. One thing, on the posterior side, there's a groove right here. I'll color it in, called the intercondylar fossa. Inter means between. Condylar just means condyles. So this groove between the condyles. Fossa means depression or groove. That occurs, and it sort of defines, not on the front side so much, it defines on the back side, the posterior side, the medial and lateral condyles themselves. Now I'm going to flip over and briefly talk about the patella. So this is the anterior, the front side. The patella, I'm going to erase this sign right here. The kneecap, the patella, is a sesamoid bone. It's kind of heart-shaped, and it rides right on front of the femur and the lower leg bone, which would be the tibia down here. So I've drawn, I'll color it in yellow. This is the patella. What you and I call the kneecap. It's that heart-shaped bone. It's sort of convex shape on the anterior side, the front side, and it's got undulations on the back side to help it fit into these places on the femur and tibia. This thing is attached, this patella is attached down here to the tibia bone. It's attached to the tibial tuberosity via the patellar tendon. So, and technically it's a ligament. So I'm going to label that patellar ligament. That's where the base of its attachment is. It sort of floats around other than that ligament attachment. There are muscles and tendons that come over the top, especially from our quadriceps, our thigh muscles that sort of do this. But the kneecap itself, when you feel it, if you have a totally relaxed leg, it can move around a little bit because its main point of attachment is just this patellar ligament into the tibial tuberosity down here. So it's functionally, I'm just going to give you a function of this, the patella. What it does is it increases the leverage of the quadriceps muscles. So I'm drawing an arrow up for increases leverage of the quadriceps. And those are the four, quad means four, those are the four big muscles coming down from our thigh. So it increases the leverage of the quadriceps muscles, which enables our knee joint to bend, our lower leg to lift upward when those quadriceps flex. It gives it leverage, so it's easier for us to sort of extend our lower leg at the knee joint. All right, now I'm going to go down, I'm going to go to a new whiteboard, but we're going to talk about this bone, the tibia. That's the lower leg bone, the larger of the two lower leg bones. And it's shaped something like this. It kind of has a T-shaped top or a triangular shaped top. So on the anterior side, looks like this, and then it narrows. This is our shin bone as it narrows down here, and it would be longer than this, but I'm going to run out of space, so I'll cut it off. And at the bottom, kind of looks like this at the distal end. So this would be proximal at the knee. This would be distal down at the ankle. And this is the tibia. It is one of the most, probably it is the largest, not bone in the body. The femur is actually longer and weighs more, but it's the largest weight-bearing bone. Everything above it, meaning everything, all of the bones and all the weight that they carry with musculature and organs, all of the weight comes down from the femur onto the tibia, and then ultimately down here onto one of the tarsals, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the medial and lateral condyles, this would be the medial condyle at the knee joint, the proximal end, and this would be the lateral condyle. These condyles articulate with the femoral condyles, medial and lateral femoral condyles, creating that knee joint. And that we say that it forms the tibiofemoral joint at the knee. I'll write that out. That would be formed here with the condyles of the femur. The head of the fibula. So I'm just going to erase this writing right here so that I can fit in the other lower leg bone, the fibula. The head of the fibula kind of tucks into, this is the lateral side. So if we're looking at the front of somebody's leg, this is the right leg, and the fibula does this. And it articulates with the tibia. So this would be, let me label this the fibula. That's the narrower, smaller of the two lower leg bones. The fibula, note, this is worth noting up here. The fibula does not articulate with the femur, only with the tibia itself. So the fibula does not participate in making up the knee joint. So I'm going to write no articulation with the femur. It does articulate with the tibia itself right here, down here. And when we do joints after this in our next unit, there's an interosseous membrane of fibrous connective tissue between, it's like a sheet of fibrous tissue between these two bones right here. So back to, I'm going to talk about both the tibia and the fibula now since I've drawn both of them. The anterior border, there's a bulge right here. You can feel it right under your kneecap, right under your patella, this big bulge in the bone. This is called the tibial tuberosity. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself with my writing. And the tibial tuberosity, that piece of bone that sticks out, is what the patellar ligament attaches to. We drew that ligament from the patella attaching down here on the tibia. That's right where it attaches to that tibial tuberosity. There's a crest. We all know this, our shin blade, a crest right here on the front of the tibia. That's very sharp. All right, this makes up the tibia fibula distal connection down here is what makes up our ankle joint, our distal ankle joint. So I'm going to talk about that for just a moment. This part of the tibia is called the medial because it points toward the midline of the body. The medial malleolus. Don't worry about malleolus in Latin means hammer, but this is our inside ankle bone, our medial ankle, what you and I would call our inside ankle bone. That's part of the tibia. What you and I call our outside ankle bone, more scientifically, it's the lateral. This would be here. That's the lateral malleolus of the fibula bone. So let me highlight that. what you and I call our outside ankle bone is the lateral malleolus of the fibula. So they're two separate bones that make up our ankle, what you and I call our ankle bones that stick out. The distal end of both of these bones right here articulates with the talus bone of the ankles. So both, I'll highlight them in color so that you can see both here of the fibula and here of the tibia. So I'm going to write both lower leg bones articulate with what's called the talus, and that's one of our ankle bones, one of the 7 tarsals. So really quickly in review, I'm just gonna say a few things and look at the picture as I'm saying these things. There's this interosseous membrane. I'll talk more in detail about that in our next unit of joints. There is the ankle bone is made up of really the tibia, the fibula, and the talus, which is a tarsal. Both the tibia and fibula have direct articulations with that talus bone. They also have articulations with each other right here. Note up here that at the proximal end, the tibia and fibula articulate with each other. There's a connection there, but there is no connection between the fibula bone and the femur. The knee joint is all just femur and tibia articulation. The tibia is the most common broken bone in the lower leg. In the leg proper, as a matter of fact, most common broken leg bone. The fibula really helps stabilize this ankle joint right here. That's its main function, is to stabilize that ankle joint. I just remember the medial malleolus is actually part of the tibia. The lateral malleolus, that outside ankle bone, is part of the fibula bone. All right, now I'm going to move on to the tarsals, the ankle bones. We're getting close to the end, which is good news. These are our ankle bone propers. Even though the ends of the tibia and fibula make up what you and I call our inside and outside ankle bone, technically the tarsals are the ankle bones, and there's 7 total. And really they sit in the foot proper. So the very top of the foot and the heel are actually made up of these tarsal bones. So the 7 tarsal bones, I'm going to name them. There's the talus, and I'll list them first and then talk about each one. The calcaneus. I'll just so you know, this is the largest in size of all of the tarsals. Then there are 3 cuneiforms, and that's spelled Cuneiforms. There's 3 cuneiforms, and they're medial, intermediate, and lateral. Intermediate, lateral. And there's a navicular bone and a cuboid. So we've got 1, 2, 3 makes 5, 6, 7. Now I'm going to talk about the talus. This is the one that bears most of the weight coming down from the tibia. So the talus, you know, that articulates, just to remind you, the tibia, which is the major weight-bearing bone in the lower leg, but it also articulates with the fibula, on the lateral side. And this is called, this articulation of the talus, tibia, and fibula, we call this the talocrural joint, Talocrural, talocrural joint. The talus transmits roughly 50% of the body weight to the calcaneus, which is the large heel bone, and the other 50% sort of goes forward to the other tarsals. So this one bears almost all of the weight coming down from the tibia. This one, a very, very minor amount. And then the talus bone, let me try to draw you a picture, it'll help you. The talus bone then distributes the weight all over the foot, sort of forward and back. So we're getting close to the end, so this is probably my last picture, but let me draw the top of the foot over here. We have the talus.
My phone?
Sorry?
Oh,
You guys okay?
yeah.
So I'm going to label these. This is looking down a bird's eye view. There's the talus bone. Then the heel bone sticks out the calcaneus like this, sort of going back, comes up on the side. So this is the calcaneus. You're looking straight down at your right foot. The cuboid kind of comes off to the lateral side, outside of the foot like this. And then the navicular sits right in front of the talus and it runs horizontally. That's a U, navicular. And then from the navicular, we get the medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. They go like this, the medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. So that's medial, intermediate, lateral. These are all cuneiforms. That makes up the 7 tarsal bones. All of the weight coming down from the tibia pretty much comes down on the talus. And then the talus distributes roughly 50% of that weight forward to these bones and 50% of the weight back here to the calcaneus, the heel bone. The metatarsals, which are the first long bones, we're still in the fleshy part of the foot. We're not out into the toes yet. The metatarsals are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 starts over here and comes all the way out. So these would be 5 metatarsals. So the whole top of your foot really is made up of the metatarsals and the top tarsal bones themselves. All right, so we've got 1 through 5 metatarsals, and they're numbered just from medial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They articulate medially. The metatarsals articulate medially right along here with the first, second, and third cuneiforms, and distally and proximally with the phalanges. So distally out here. So this is more of a proximal articulation. This is a distal articulation. And then after those metatarsals, we get phalanges, just like in the fingers. There's 14 phalanges per foot. So I'm just going to write 14 phalanges. There's 3 in each toe. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And they're labeled just proximal, medial, and distal. And then the big toe just has 2, like the thumb. That's what we get. That's how we get 14. The scientific name for the big toe is the hallux. So just remember, the hallux only has 2 phalanges in it. The scientific name for the thumb is called the pollex. So the hallux and the pollex both have 2 phalanges. All of the other toes and fingers have 3 each. Last conversation, I'm going to briefly talk about foot arches. So as the fibula comes down here on the outside of the leg and the tibia behind it, bearing the weight down onto the talus would look something like this. So our talus bone is going to be here. Calcaneus would stick out this way. I want to talk about the arches of the foot. Metatarsals come down here. And the toes would be sort of, all right, so there's a foot, a skeletal foot. The arches of the foot, there's a longitudinal arch of the foot, and I'll try to use the same colors as your book. There's something that we call the medial longitudinal arch and the lateral longitudinal arch. The medial longitudinal arch is more down the center of the foot like this. The lateral longitudinal arch, I'll try to use the same colors as your book, is more on the outside of the foot, the lateral side. So we have 2 longitudinal arches, medial front to back and lateral front to back. And then there's something called the transverse arch, which goes from medial to lateral side. It goes directly from the inside of the foot. Your book uses a red line. It goes from the inside of the foot, way on the other side of the foot here, up across and down this way. So that would be a transverse arch. So the longitudinal arches basically go from the calcaneus bone back here. These are the longitudinal arches, and they run from the calcaneus all the way through the metatarsals like this. The transverse arch goes basically from the cuboid across the cuneiform, so across the top of the foot like this would be the transverse arch. All right, we have made it all the way through the appendicular skeleton, so I'm just gonna cut my recording.